Oh, hi. Hello there. I was just doing a little bit of light reading today. Now that you're here, though, let's talk. Chris, Liege of Games. Simon, they've put out their latest Kickstarter, the 8th iteration on the Zombicide flagship. What do you need to know about it? More importantly, how does it compare to the other Zombicides out there? Is this one worth getting? Do you already have the better one for you? What makes this one so different? Why should you be interested in it? Or why should you pass on it? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the differences between Undead or Alive, Invader, Green Horde, and Black Plague. Now, if you're just stumbling upon this and you're going, Chris, what is Zombicide? Why is Zombicide making so much money? Well, let me tell you. Zombicide is the fantasy-esque Walking Dead style game that is a dungeon crawl in the aspect of you're controlling characters moving through areas fighting zombies, trying to avoid being overrun by the zombie horde, while all still trying to complete certain objectives to win the game. It is fully cooperative and it is relatively straightforward. Why are there so many iterations of this game? It's because it's not only done well on Kickstarter, raising in the seven figures, the millions and millions and millions of dollars, but it's also done quite well at retail. When I say it's Simon's flagship game, I mean that in all aspects. This is their moneymaker. And with the Kickstarter, they have provided plenty of opportunity for exclusivity as well as the fear of missing out. What do I mean by that? I mean that this is a very plastic miniature driven system. All of these characters that I mentioned, both zombies and player characters, are represented by miniatures. Hence the name Simon, cool mini or not. Now let's talk about Zombicide in general, just so you know where I'm going with this. Let's do a comparison head to head to head, and let's take a look. So Zombicide Black Plague, this funded in 2015. This raised just over $4 million. This is the medieval, archaic zombies, knights, archers, fantasy Merlin-esque Knights of the Round Table sort of theme. Then we had Green Horde in 2017. This is essentially an expansion standalone of the previous medieval version that adds more and more and more. This raised just over $5 million. Then we had Zombicide Invader, the space-themed Zombicide where nobody can hear the zombie scream. And that was in 2018, and that raised $3.3 million. Most recently, in the end of 2019, we had Zombicide 2.0, a redesigning of the whole Zombicide system to hopefully eliminate some of the criticisms, the critiques, as well as the faults of the game in the first place. And they did it in more of a modern version, Washington, D.C. This raised, again, just over $3.4 million. That leads us up to the latest iteration of Zombicide, the Zombicide Undead and Alive. They have taken the Western and the Western Legends theme and now imparted it and imbued it to the Zombicide legacy. So, now that you've heard all about them, what makes them all different? Why would you get one over the other? First off, let's just get that out of the way. The main appeal to many of us is the aesthetic and the theme that is applicable. The one that we most like, the one that we most have biased towards or even dislike. And so that's the reason why I'm talking about these different ones, because some people prefer the more dark medieval, some prefer a little bit more light fantasy medieval, some prefer more of the space, some prefer just the modern post-apocalyptic, and now we have the Western, all appealing to a different demographic, but still the core demographic of the dungeon crawl scene. And Zombicide is not thought of as the deepest, most thoughtful, strategic dungeon crawl out there. It is a dungeon crawl as the relative gamer term, which I dislike, but people relate to it as a beer and pretzels game. I think of it more as this is a dungeon crawler that is easy to get to the table, that has lower overhead, that you can get people who are not familiar with it as much to be able to play. Because, if nothing else, Most people nowadays, due to the pop culture influence of The Walking Dead, are at least familiar with that and can conceptualize that as what they're doing in the game. And so that right there translates well for people who may not be otherwise interested in the first place. Because Walking Dead introduced this whole genre to a whole generation and a whole plethora of people that otherwise would have had no interest in this 20 years ago. Now, when we're talking about the differences between these games, I think it's important to note that these last three games, Undead and Alive, Zombicide 2.0, and Zombicide Invader, all have sort of a more revamped rules from previous critiques on Zombicide, Zombicide Season 2, Season 3, Black Plague, as well as Green Horde. Some of these being the targeting system, some of these being the noise system, some of these being just the gameplay itself. Especially with the latest two iterations, it even goes as far as how you are spawning some of the zombies and what interactions are on the maps in different games. Now let's just break it down a little bit for some of the examples that I'm talking about. So some of the older versions, when you have Black Plague or Green Horde, where you have weapons like bows or crossbows or anything that shoots, you run into the scenario of having to reload as an action. Whereas in some of the newer games with Invaders and 2.0, as well as Undead, reloading is not an action. So it's simplifying it and streamlining it as one of the annoyances. The other big critique that you will see is even the priority targeting system. How in some of the older iterations of the game, you would be inadvertently having some friendly fire if someone was in your way, and you would just hit them first instead of hitting the zombies. And so that has changed as well with the newer iterations, that you are not hitting them, or you were hitting them only on a missed roll, not a hit roll. Speaking of how they're interacting on the board, the newest iteration, Undead and Alive, has completely removed doors. The big annoyance or benefit depending on how you wanted to game the game or manipulate the system in the past. Not only in this game, but in many other dungeon crawlers where bad guys, me know how to open door, me run into and stuck. It gets rid of that manipulation for better and for worse. That plays directly into part of the objective of this game as a whole. Now, in the older iterations, Green Horde, Black Plague, as opposed to Invaders 2.0 and Undead and Alive, the previous two, if all of your survivors died, you lost. Now, with the newer iteration, they have put more of an emphasis on less recklessness, even though you're battling zombie hordes en masse. And now you will lose if you lose one survivor, and that stands true in this latest iteration. Now, I think you can make a little bit of an argument going back to the characters that there is not a lot of highly variable character delineation between a lot of these games. If you think of what the basic dungeon crawl is, you have sort of your mage, your glass cannon, your tank, your melee guy, your paladin, your warrior, your berserker, and then you have some sort of cleric or healer or holy man, and then you have maybe another ranger or something along those lines that's sort of a jack of all trades. And Undead and Alive is no different than, some of those other iterations. They just reskin it and call it slightly different and tweak it a little bit. So one of the other aspects in one of the older games is that you do have a little bit more variation with this medieval-esque fantasy theme. Black Plague probably introduces one of the more unique things in terms of the enemies, where you have a necromancer, where they spawn new zones or spawns of places where zombies are going to come out from in the first place. I mean, it creates a whole new lose condition. Now, in some of the later iterations, you have a little bit of counteracting in terms of what the players can actually do to help mitigate some of these massive zombie swarms. Things like focus fire, or in Undead, you have an ability to sort of spray. They've introduced a Gatling gun as well. So other mechanisms to take out these zombies en masse, as opposed to something like Green Horde, where I believe they introduced more of the trebuchet. Also, just by where things are at in terms of the models and the miniatures, the Western does not really seem to lend itself to a variety of things. All of these guys look very generic and very similar. They're all wearing hats, they all have big cloaks on, or big wavy dresses, and they're all very similar looking. Whereas in some of the other iterations, with the abominations, I mean, look at the differences there, even with the characters. I mean, none of these characters are exactly wearing the same thing. They all have different varieties. Most of them are are having some sort of armor, but the variety that is in with even all of those is significantly more different. Same thing with the invaders. I mean, look at the variety that's in these zombies and these abominations. So, Undead and Alive, is it going to have that? It definitely doesn't have it on the characters. And so, if you want more of an experience or more of a relatable pop culture influence, the older games have a lot more. There is not much pop culture influence, unless you're from my generation or older, that many people are probably going to recognize in Undead or Alive. I mean, most people can recognize a few of these names, but can you say some of the backstory or some of the influences like you could in some of these other projects of where this stuff is coming from? Anything mythological wise? Can you really compare that to, or some of the space stuff where we all know a lot of what they're being based off of in the first place? Can't really say that as much in the Western game. The other difference when we're talking about the zombies and when they spawn is if you run out of a certain type of zombies in the old game, the other zombies just don't get bonus activations or anything like that. In this game, you get a whole new abomination spawn. So that really changes maybe your focus from what you were doing before to having to mitigate your strategy differently now. The characters, as we have sequentially gone forward in all of these games, they have also tried to simplify the overhead from that side of things, and Undead or Alive does another level with that as well, limiting some of the abilities that you're going to see in terms of the differences between the classes or even the characters themselves. In Undead and Alive, they have one or two fixed abilities with a favored weapon type for most part with these classes. Many of the other previous iterations do not limit it nearly in that extent, and I believe that's probably trying to, again, to appeal the overhead and the ability to get the game to the table. Now let's talk strategy of these games. How does the strategy, how do some of these rules tie into what you're going to expect and what you're going to see, and which method you prefer in a dungeon crawl? With Black Plague and Green Horde, in the fantasy-esque realm, zombies are spawned at static points throughout the map. You're trying to get and find weapons that will allow you to do enough damage to the abominations, because abominations in all of these iterations cannot be killed by normal weapons, and except for things that do 3 damage, which are special weapons that you cannot get otherwise elsewhere easily. And they have summoners, which are going to increase the spawn rates that are also going to try to exit the map to cause the endgame. In Invader, more of the sci-fi version, you have the abundant use of the doors that I previously mentioned. They are now being used to stem strategically the flow of these zombies, but it also introduces more of a creep factor where the big bads or the abominations form spawn points along the way as they move. This is where that focused fire that I mentioned earlier can be used as a special ability to kill these big bads instead, in the previous iterations, of having to scramble around to find the correct weapon that is the only thing that can kill these larger abominations. So less frantic searching and randomization from that side of things. They also introduce other more static objects, especially on the player side, such as turrets and machines. Version 2.0, the more modern day, takes more of an emphasis on the campaign and the storyline than several of the others. And there is a significant more types of zombies that you have to be aware of, that you have to be able to deal with. And so you're going to have more strategy, but also much more of a tactical nature, because it is not, unlike some of these other versions, a very limited set of the differences you're going to see sometimes, especially in the core games. And I mean, that's relatively true across all of these, but by far the most iterations within those set groups is the 2.0 version that people seem to enjoy. The 2.0 version also adds the variability of the day and the night cycle, having to deal with different actions and consequences during each different time of day. However, as you can imagine, with those different elements being added in, there is also the thought that the 2.0 modern post-apocalyptic version is much more heavier overhead for those looking for something slightly more streamlined. So what's new about this latest version in Undead or Alive? They're adding a few more elements. They're changing especially how the noise element works from the previous games in order to attract zombies. The louder you are, the more noise you're making with guns or explosions or dynamite in this game, for example. It changes how they are drawn towards you. It simplifies it a little bit so it's a little bit less finicky. They make it simplified where there is just one token with two sides, a bang, and a boom. The noise token essentially follows the largest group of survivors around, as you would think that they would be making the most noise, or if someone is firing, say, the Gatling gun or a gun somewhere else, it is going to go to the boom side and go there instead. But when you have this boom side activated, it is not moved by the bangs, the smaller noises then. It then stays in that spot, gets flipped over, and then, and only then, after the next turn, starts moving around as the bang again. The other new thing that they add in this is not vehicles, at least so far, but they have this train tile here that acts as an active train moving through a portion of the board, which can be both a hindrance as well as a very strong help, because it can block line of sight in terms of you being able to attack zombies. It can make it impassable at times, but it can also kill zombies at the end of the round if the zombies are in the way of the oncoming train, and that's true even with abominations. So that is a brief overview of the Zombicide system with a little bit of nuance, with a little bit of detail, with a little bit of variations between the games. Now, the consistency between all of them is if you are getting the Kickstarter pledge, you are going to be getting a very large amount of game. The biggest problem is that some of these games have more variation within that mound of plastic than others. And then this, in combination with your preference of the theme, ultimately probably are some of the biggest factors in determining. Are you willing to take a little bit less streamlined rules or a little bit more nuance there in some of the older versions for the fantasy elements with the dragons and the necromancers and the magic? Or do you prefer something that is maybe a little bit higher in variation in terms of the type of enemies you'll see, maybe with a little bit more overhead, with a little bit more strategy in the modern 2.0 version? Or are you really nail on the head with this latest version as the Western, focusing on this more tactical, strategic nature with the difference in line of sight and balconies and interior design changes in terms of interactions there, along with a moving train tile through the center? Ultimately, the choice is yours. The only other thing that you have to take into account is a lot of these on the secondary market are still quite expensive. Zombicide, for whatever reason, has held up very well on the secondary market. And so even these older iterations, Black Plague, Green Horde, even Invaders, not quite as well, but still good, have held up their value and then some. Just for not even all-in pledges, but even decently massive size lots. And so it is more a buyer beware in that sense. And so it is definitely whatever iteration you prefer. I would highly recommend watching gameplay, because sometimes these nuances and these differences that I mentioned up here, you understand, but does it translate down here to how you like to play? And so that is by far my biggest recommendation of any of these. Because with all of these now, there is plenty of that out there. But the cheapest on many of these is just to get them on the Kickstarter when they are active or as a late pledge. And with Undead or Alive running at the time of this filming, you have that option. So, what do you think? What's your favorite iteration of Zombicide? Why is that your favorite iteration of Zombicide? Let me know what you think. Let me know whether or not you think it's worth it with the new one, with some of the differences in the rules, or not. As always, thanks for watching. If you liked it, throw me a sub. I have a Patreon if you really feel generous. But otherwise, I just appreciate the click. Have a great night. Have a great day. Stay classy.